Today we're going to start a class on the letter of Galatians. Galatians is a book that is oftentimes overlooked, and I hate that because it's hard to say that a book of the Bible is great because they're all great. They're all inspired. But Galatians has always had a dear place in my heart. I did several projects and papers on the book of Galatians when I was in college, so maybe that's why I'm slightly biased. I'm also a big fan of Paul. And when I was doing this class, Brittany saw my notes and she said, "Man, when you talk about Paul, you just go on and on and on forever." Well, I like Paul. Paul's a cool guy. And so I'm going to talk about Paul this morning, and I'll try not to go on and on and on and try to keep it somewhat lively. But the book of Galatians is a fantastic book. I think it's something that we can learn from. Galatia was a province of Rome. And if you take your Bibles and you turn to Acts chapter 13 and 14, you see on Paul's first missionary journey, him and Barnabas are going through the province of southern Galatia. Well, the province of Galatia, the southern portion of that province. And we can see there's a common theme that takes place every time they go into a new city in Galatia. We can see that they go into the region and they start preaching in Acts 13 verses 14 and following. The whole region begins to respond to the message, and we see that in verses 44 through 50. And do I have that on the slide? Let me see. No, I don't. And so they go through the whole region. They start preaching. There's a problem. Every time they go into a city and preach that Jesus is the Jewish Savior who has now opened up salvation to the Gentiles, and the law of Moses is no longer the way that we please God, the Jews run him out of every city. They go to Antioch of Pisidia first. The Jews run them out, even though several of the Jews and a lot of Gentiles are converted. They run out of Antioch of Pisidia. Then they go to Iconium in verses 51 through Acts 14, verse 7. And there in Iconium, they have a message that's well received. But once again, the Jews start stirring up the townspeople, and they ran out of Iconium. They go to Lystra. And when Paul and Barnabas go to Lystra, they actually heal a man. And while he's there teaching and preaching, the news starts traveling that these two men have come, these foreigners, and they've just healed somebody. And so the priests at the temple of Zeus go and get animal sacrifices, are parading them through the town to make an animal sacrifice because they knew that Zeus and Hermes have come down to earth and are in their midst. And Paul has to actually stop the priests of Zeus from making sacrifices because they think he's Hermes and Barnabas is Zeus. And the whole town is just in a fury. Well, the Jews realize what's coming on. They drag Paul out of the town and they stone him to death. At least they think he's dead. The text tells us that he gets back up after some time. He walks right back in the city and he picks up where he left off. But eventually they have to go out of Lystra as well. And so then they go on to Derbe and they ran out of there again. And the passage tells us that they then backtracked around those different towns, strengthening the brethren that had been established in those different cities, and they appointed elders in every congregation. Acts 14 verses 20 through 25. Now Galatians is one of the earliest letters that Paul wrote because of the hostility. I mean, in every one of these towns, Paul was ran out by the Jewish population that was there. And so very, very early, these young Christians have to combat these Judaizers, these Jews who are trying to make these Gentile Christians keep Jewish aspects of the old law. And so Paul has to write Galatians to remind them of the gospel that they were called to, and not to listen to these teachers that are trying to bind on them things that are not bound. And so let's talk a little bit about the author, Paul. Paul was a perfect person for this. Paul was said in Acts 9 to be a chosen instrument of God. I don't think that that's hyperbole by the Scriptures, because when you look at Paul's credentials, I can't think of anybody who was a better missionary to the Gentiles in the first century. He was from a cultured and important city in Tarsus. It had a large Jewish population, but it was a Gentile city. It was a very wealthy city, and so Paul was a Roman citizen. They gave him the ability to roam around the world at that time and go pretty much anywhere that he wanted to go, and also gave him special privileges when it came to jail time and also how the authorities treated him. He knew the Scriptures frontwards and backwards. He was a Benjamin, so he was from a tribe that had a good standing in the Old Testament. He was a Pharisee, and he was a Hebrew of Hebrews. He basically says, I would have put myself up under the old law against anybody. He was highly educated in Jerusalem by Gamaliel. Gamaliel is actually quoted in the book of Acts. He knew the priesthood and Judaism. He had integrity. He said, I never violated my conscience or the law. He persecuted Christians. He knew his opponents, and he was very committed. He was all in. And he had seen Jesus. And you think about, well, why is this important? Because you have someone who says, okay, I was a better Jew than any of you jokers. Like, you guys over here trying to make the Jewish law, Mosaic law, bound to these Gentiles, you think you're good Jews? I was better than all of you. Like, how many of you went to Jerusalem and was taught by Gamaliel? None of you? Oh, okay. Anybody here who was a Hebrew of Hebrews or a Pharisee? No? Anybody on the fast track to the Sanhedrin and being one of the leaders of the Jewish nation? Anybody? No? Okay. So when Paul rebukes the Judaizers in Galatians, he comes down really forceful because he says, look, he basically says, I'm better than you. Like, don't act like because you're Jews and you keep the Mosaic law that you're better than me. Because let me tell you, I'm an apostle, and even if you're going by Jewish standards, I'm better than you are. And so when Paul talks to the Judaizers in the book of Galatians, he doesn't hold back any punches. He's extremely forceful. But you have this guy who knew Judaism so well, but was also familiar with a Gentile background and a Roman citizen. And it's because of that he was able to go about the known Roman world of the time and establish so many congregations and be such an effective evangelist and missionary. What Paul was able to do in the first century truly is remarkable. He had confidence. He said, I was circumcised on the 8th day, which was a commandment that God gave Abraham in Genesis 17:12. He says, I was an Israelite, Genesis 32:28. He says, I was from the tribe of Benjamin, where the first king Saul was from. He says, I was a Hebrew of Hebrews. He talks about that in Acts chapter 6. He says, I was a Pharisee in Acts 23 verse 8, 26 verse 5. They were the strictest of those who interpreted the Mosaic law. He says, I was a persecutor of Christians, Acts 26, 9 through 11, and 1 Corinthians 15, 9. And he said, before the law, I was blameless. Acts 23:1. Now, many people have taken what Paul said in Acts 23:1 and said, what does he mean I was blameless before the law? Does that mean he's saying he was perfect? No, he's not saying he's perfect. He was just saying that he could stand before the law and be blameless, that he never violated the law of his own conscience, that he was not perfect, but that he did not take the law lightly and did not spurn the law. He was an authentic Jew, and he had the right to speak on the subject, and he was a living illustration of what the Jews needed to do. He was not speaking from somebody that did not have the experience. If you're going through something, it's nice to have somebody who's already been there. If you're on a diet plan, you want somebody who has been through that transition themselves. I think about if you're coming out of denominationalism to the church, you might want to sit down and talk with somebody who's made that journey themselves, because you can appreciate they've had to go through something similar to what you have had to go through. That's what Paul was to these Jews who were trying to make this transition from the Mosaic law to this new law in Christ. And so, can anybody tell me what modern day country this is right here in Asia Minor? Anybody good at geography?
Let's see, Texas.
Texas, that's right. It's not Texas, but the Texas is on the map. Good. It's Turkey, right? Asia Minor is modern-day Turkey. And so the province of Galatia was in Turkey. You can see the size of Texas there, how big Asia Minor is. So if you've been in Texas, Texas is pretty good size. And so Asia Minor is a pretty good chunk of landmass that is now present-day Turkey. That is where Galatia is found. In fact, on this map, you can see it was broken down to different provinces. And you can see that Galatia right there stretches from the back end of Turkey, or back there towards the, I don't know if that's the Baltic Sea or whatever that is, all the way down towards the Mediterranean right there. And so you can see that Galatia was right there. It was an extremely important city. And so these few cities that we talk about is the ones that Paul was writing to. And there are the colored lines. You can see the different missionary journeys that Paul went through that region, through that area. And of course, you can see on a map today, Paul's travels once again. It's kind of hard to see that map. Okay, these are the congregations that were established, or the cities that were visited on the first missionary journey. Okay, you can see they're like Antioch of Syria, chapter 13, verses 1 through 3. Seleucia, chapter 13, verse 4. All right, the blue. Can anybody tell me what the blue cities have in common? They're in Galatia, right? So, good. So, the blue ones are Galatia. When he writes the letter to the Galatians, it wasn't to one congregation, it was to all the congregations of Galatia. And if you notice, all four of these, he had basically been ran out of town by the Jews. And so, we have southern Galatia, Paul and Barnabas evangelized this area on their first missionary journey twice. They went through, they got to the end, they turned around, and went back through again, hitting them one more time and establishing elders. Acts 13 through 14 is around 47 AD, where they first met opposition of Jewish leaders. So in 47 AD, about how old is the church at this time? How long has the church been established?
14.
Okay, it's roughly AD 30, right? Probably closer to maybe 26, but let's just say AD 30. And so 20 years, right? Roughly 15 to 20 years, the church has been established at this point, and it's already stretched all the way from Palestine all the way to Asia Minor. I mean, the gospel message is being carried all over the known world at the time. And so they go to these cities in Derbe and Lystra, Iconium, and Pisidia of Antioch that ran out of town. It's also interesting to note that how many missionary journeys did Barnabas go on with Paul? How many? Wasn't 2. Wasn't 3. 1, right? The first one. The first one was the only time that Barnabas and Paul went on a missionary journey together, the Bible tells us. And the second missionary journey they got started, before they left, there was an argument over a certain individual. Anybody remember? Mark, right? Paul said, if he's going, I ain't going. And so they decided to split up. And so, but Barnabas is mentioned more times in the book of Galatians than any other book that we have. And so it makes sense that Barnabas played a key part in the establishment of these congregations, as did Paul. And so Paul used the Roman province and not the geographical area. And it's interesting to note that when Paul sends delegates to Jerusalem to bring money to the saints who are struggling in a famine, that there are representatives. Gaius is from Derbe and Timothy is from Lystra. And so he picks up Timothy on one of these on the first missionary journey as he goes to Lystra. And so we ask ourselves, why was the book of Galatians written? Well, after Paul visited the area, a serious problem developed there, as indicated by the abruptness of Paul's letter. Galatians 1:6, I am amazed that you were so quickly, right? So, I mean, Paul has not been far out of Galatia before he has to go back, not go back physically, he's already been twice, he has to write a letter because of Judaizers, right? They're preaching a new gospel. He says not that it's a new gospel, but the fact that it is a false gospel and false teachers. The teaching apparently evolved around keeping parts of the old law, especially circumcision, Galatians 5:2, which also led to Paul saying that if you justify yourself by the old law in one respect, you have to keep the entire law, Galatians 5 verse 3. That's important for us today for a variety of reasons. But Paul was shocked that these Christians, although young, were so quickly falling back into this trap. And so the Judaizers had claimed that they had gotten their message from the Jerusalem apostles. And so Gentile Christians were being led astray. Judaizers had apparently claimed to have gotten their message from the Jerusalem apostles, which spurned Paul's apostolic authority. And this led to Paul's very personal self-defense. Now, earlier in this lesson, I said Paul doesn't hold back any punches. Well, that's because when Paul leaves, these Jews come in and say, well, Paul's not really an apostle. Did he tell you he was an apostle? Oh, he did? He told you he was an apostle? He's not really an apostle. Actually, there are 12 apostles. 11 of those apostles were with Jesus for 3 years during his earthly ministry. Matthias was then added to the apostles right after Jesus came back and before his ascension, because they needed to have 12 for the 12 tribes of Israel. Paul would make 13. Paul's not an apostle. And so these people have either tried to convince or convinced these new converts that Paul is some sort of charlatan, that he's not a real apostle, and that he doesn't have the authority of the Jerusalem apostles. And so Paul takes out a letter and says, okay. And so then he starts giving his defense. And when we look at the book of Galatians coming up in the next few weeks, we'll see his defense that he gives, where he basically says, y'all be quiet before I come over and knock y'all around, right? And so Paul is very upset at what they have accused him of. And so when was the letter written? Well, if the missionary journey happened between 47 and 49 or 46 and 48, it was likely written around the exact same time. Within weeks, months, probably less than a year of these congregations being established. And so he wrote very, very soon after that took place. Paul was the author. He obviously wrote sometime after he evangelized the area. He mentions that in chapter 4, verse 13. And Paul and Silas would also pass through this area again on their second missionary journey, strengthening after the Jerusalem Council of Acts 15:40. And on this visit, Paul and Silas actually shared the results of the council as they went, chapter 16, verse 4. And so this would put Galatians as one of the earliest of Paul's letters, perhaps maybe the earliest. It's debated who you ask what are some of the earliest letters, but normally Galatians and 1st and 2nd Thessalonians are going to be listed as the earliest letters that Paul wrote. And so one of the interesting questions that has arisen from the book of Galatians, before we go on, does anybody have any questions so far about what we've discussed about the book of Galatians? I realize this is more kind of background information. If you like that stuff, this will be interesting to you. If not, I promise next week when we start with the text, you'll like that better. But does anybody have any questions so far about the Galatians, the letter? Yes, Brother Smith.
How was Paul an Israelite and a Hebrew and so on?
How was he? Bloodline, lineage. And so what was interesting about Paul was that he was a Jew, was a Benjamite, and that he was a Roman citizen. Because in the ancient world, it was really hard to have both. Now, later on in the empire, you have some crazy emperors, and they pretty much give Roman citizenship to anybody. But in the first century, Roman citizenship was something that was coveted. I mean, it was super important. It meant that you had rights. Most people that were Roman citizens say, he stole my goods, and they would just go and kill you. I mean, you didn't really get a trial. And so with him being a Roman citizen, he was promised a fair trial. He had the authority to appeal to Caesar, which Paul would later use in his lifetime. He could not be beaten or mistreated without a trial. He could not be crucified. And he was able to travel to anywhere in the Roman Empire. And so he was able to use both those things for himself. But that's how he was a Jew. He was by birth, by his bloodline. So, good question. Any other questions?
NXP footnote says there's two possible designations on dates for the writing, depending on the northern or the southern Galatian theories.
Yeah. The northern Galatian theory, I think, is unprobable, impossible at best. I actually have a 15-page research paper, Billy Wayne, on the on the northern and southern Galatian theories, if you'd like to read that. And so, to me, it seems obvious. One of the reasons why the northern Galatian theory was so prevalent for so long was two reasons. Number one, scholars said Galatians sounds a lot like Romans. And we don't think Paul could have had the same theology at the beginning of his missionary work as the end of his missionary work. It seems like it's too high. He knows too much. He hasn't developed these things in his mind. Well, I would say hogwash to that, right? Because I think he's inspired at the beginning and the end. Now, the second reason why they think Northern Galatian was because at the end of the first century, the province of Galatia actually changed. And so these cities that we were mentioning were not in Galatia anymore. And so a lot of these individuals, and they're like, well, Jerome in the 5th century thinks it's here. Well, I mean, when Jerome was alive, Galatia was northern Galatia. There was no southern Galatia. And so they just didn't know. And so, but when we look at the things that he writes about in Galatia, we'll talk more about Galatians chapter 2 when he talks about his two trips to Jerusalem, which, Galatians trip 2 is either going to be Acts 11 or Acts 15. If it's Acts 15 and it's already taken place, it makes no sense why he would not bring that up while he's trying to refute circumcision. And so that note is correct. There is some disputes as to the dating because of northern and southern Galatia, but I think the northern Galatian theory is really, really weak, very weak. But I appreciate the great comment. Thank you so much. So, any other questions or comments? No? Okay, great. Acts 11 and, Billy Wayne, you're perfect, man. You're right on time. So, Acts 11 and Galatians 2. Paul made 3 visits to Jerusalem in Acts, okay? In Acts chapter 9, he goes on his initial visit to say, hey guys, I know I've been killing your family members for being Christians, but I'm one of you now. And so we cool? Like we're buddies? And that takes some time to work out in Acts chapter 9. Then he goes back to the famine visit in Acts chapter 11. The congregations there in Jerusalem are suffering because there's a famine in Jerusalem. Of course, these Christians have been ostracized by the Jewish nation as crazy people, and so he brings money to them to help the poor. And then in chapter 3, he goes to the council visit in Acts 15, where they discuss, what are we going to make the Gentiles have to do? Are we going to require circumcision? Because all these Jewish Christians say that Gentiles should keep circumcision as a part of the old law because it is older than the old law and goes all the way back to Abraham. And so Galatians speaks of 2 visits. And this goes back to that northern southern Galatian theory, is what does Galatians 2 visit correspond to? Is 2, 1 through 10, is that the famine visit of Acts 11, or is that the council visit of Acts 15? Because if it's on the famine visit, then it makes more sense as southern Galatia. It makes more sense it's around 46 through 48. If it's the council visit of Acts 15, it makes more sense that it's one of his later epistles with the book of Romans, and it was written probably in the late 50s, early 60s. So like when does that take place? Well, let me tell you when it takes place. It takes place in the 40s in the southern Galatia theory. If you would like more information on that, see me. I'll be more than happy to send you a copy of my paper. I think it's really good. I got an A on it. Pretty proud of it. There's probably some misspelling words, but that's not the main thing to be concerned about.
Like Donald Trump.
Yeah. It's the greatest paper in the history of the world. People tell me all the time. They say like, Isaac, the greatest paper we've ever seen. More papers. We're going to make Brittany pay for it, okay? She kind of did. She was working while I was in grad school. So, anyways, so that was not to offend you. I like Donnie. Okay, anyways, I shouldn't have done that. I'm sorry. So the reasons why, before we get to the big picture, that is Southern Galatia, and it makes more sense for Acts 11 to be the second visit, was the assembly. Galatians 2 sounds more like a private conversation than an assembly. The additions, chapter 2, verse 6 of Galatians suggests the Jerusalem leaders made no addition to Paul's preaching. Also the apostles. Paul's discussion is to show his gospel was not a hand-me-down. Paul says that I can stand on my own. So it wouldn't make any sense to refer back to a meeting where he went to talk with the other apostles in Jerusalem. Also the association. Paul said his visit was because of revelation, Galatians 2:2. And Acts 11:28 says that prophecy from Agabus led to him going to Jerusalem in Acts 11. The actions of Peter and Barnabas avoiding the Gentiles makes less sense if it's after Acts 15. And the argument, the council meeting in Jerusalem would have been the best argument to condemn these Jewish teachers, saying they had to keep circumcision, and yet he never mentions that up. If you notice the 6 things that I mentioned, what did I use right there? Assembly, additions, apostles, association, actions, and argument. Alliteration, all right? Some of y'all were listening to the sermon this morning, right? Okay, see? Preachers like that stuff. And so the big picture, the takeaways from today's class. Paul wrote around AD 47 through 48. So when we read this passage, when we study this book of Galatians, it's one of the earliest books that Paul wrote. He's writing to a group in response to Judaizers who were attacking the gospel and his apostleship. And so you're going to see a side of Paul that maybe you're not used to in his other letters. Because when Paul comes out of the gate in chapter 1 and chapter 2, I mean, he's laying down the gauntlet. I mean, the first 2 chapters really is like, let me tell you why I'm better than you are and why you should listen to me. You know, and who doesn't like to have that conversation with people? No? Just Paul? Okay. Well, I mean, Paul kind of had that authority, right? I mean, if we do it, it's arrogant. So Paul was inspired. He got away with it. Okay. The apostolic doctrine and scriptures over false teachers, which is today just as much of a need in the church today as it was in the first century. People were trying to twist the scriptures, fake news from this morning, in the early church. They're still trying to do that in the 21st century. Now, just as Paul tells these individuals, I don't care if you're young Christians. I mean, that's what he tells them. He says, now, these guys shouldn't be doing this, but I don't care that you're young Christians. You've been exposed to the truth, and I expect more out of you, right? So what do you think God expects out of us now that we've had the word for 2,000 years? Do we have an excuse if false teachers come among our midst, start teaching false things? Can we just say, well, you know, God, he seemed really smart, and he did a really good job, and he spoke really well, and we just kind of thought, well, maybe he's right. You know, if they didn't have an excuse after being Christians for weeks, months, the most maybe a year, you know, what excuse do we have with not confronting false teachers and false doctrine? And so God's going to hold us accountable for that. And we might need a pep talk just like the Christians in Galatians needed a pep talk. And
the Spirit to find out the source thereof, that's inclusive of the spirit of man.
Yeah, absolutely. And 1 John 4:1, right? Test the spirits, right? See if these things are true. And so absolutely. And that was the requirement of the Galatians in the first century, and it's the requirement of the Chapel-Hillians in the 21st century. And so God expects that of us today. And so when we think of this, one more time with alliteration, and I promise I won't use this for a couple of weeks, okay? There was a problem, right? There was a new gospel being presented. There was a Paul, right? And he defends the gospel. He defends his position as an apostle. He described the purpose of the law, why we have the law. Many people have asked me, well, Isaac, why do we have the old law? I mean, yeah, why do we have that? Why couldn't Jesus just have come, you know, at the time of Moses instead of the Mosaical law? That's an interesting question. The book of Galatians is going to address that question. So if that's one of your questions, be sure to come to class. And he declared the power of the faith. And he also left us a pattern. The problem is consistent with Acts 13 through 14. And so that pattern is still going to be there. And so when we look at the outline of the book of Galatians, we have the introduction in chapter 1, verses 1 through 9. We have the biographical argument in chapter 1:10 through 2:21, the theological argument in 3:1 through 4:31, and the practical argument in chapters 5:1 through 6:10, and then the conclusion of the letter in 6:11 through 6:18. This study will probably take us somewhere between 8 to 10 weeks. It's such great material, I don't want to rush through it. If you read ahead to the book of Galatians, it's a short book, only 6 chapters, but the chapters are very small. You could read through the book of Galatians in 10 minutes, maybe 15 minutes if you're a slow reader. And so if you want to go ahead and read the book of Galatians, maybe jot down some questions that you have from the book. Say, well, you know, in chapter 3, verse 27, it says this. I would like to know more about this. And so that way when we get to that in our class, I'll know, you know, so-and-so wants us to talk about this a little bit. And so read the book. If you have any questions, please give that to me, whether in person or by cell phone or email, whatever means is more convenient for you. And if you just have questions in general you would like for us to discuss on our Wednesday night class, we've got one more class scheduled for Wednesday night, and then the table's open. So if you've got something you would like to discuss, please be sure to let me know that. Does anybody have any questions so far about Paul, about the province of Galatia, northern or southern Galatia, modern day Turkey, Texas, the text of Galatians, anything?
Okay, so I'll ask you one.
Yeah.
Long time ago, it was several years ago. I was having a debate with the homosexual that I had gone to high school with. I haven't seen him in years and years and years. And I brought up the Bible, and it kind of goes with your lesson this morning.
Yeah.
Well, Paul perverted the gospel or the Bible. Have you heard that? Is that a common?
Yeah, that Paul perverted the Bible?
Yeah, and that throw out what he says and there's nothing.
Oh, like let's just not listen to Paul because he was like
I don't know, is that a common?
Anti-homosexual. It is common. One of the more common verses that we use in the New Testament, which is interesting because we talked about our translations on Wednesday night, and it's important because some translations the word homosexuality never occurs. Now, there's no agenda there. Wink, wink. Because I had somebody tell me one time, it was like homosexual never occurs in the New Testament. I was like, what? You know, and he's like, yeah, on the History Channel it said it doesn't occur in the New Testament. I was like, well, I don't know what translation he was using, but more the more common ones that we refer to, whether it's 1 Corinthians 6, 9 through 11, whether it's going to be Romans chapter 1, those written by Paul. And it's become more popular in modern scholarship to just whatever you don't like, just to say it's not original.
Right, what made me think of that was we went judge not lest you be judged. And all the things you put up there, Corinthians, Thessalonians.
Yeah. Yeah.
Galatians, they were all Paul's writings.
Yeah.
That was kind of what he was...
Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, they say all the time, like, you're not Christians, you're Paulites. We would say, well, Christ promised to send the Holy Spirit. Paul was inspired by the Holy Spirit. His words are Christ's words, not Paul's words, right? And show me a place where they contradict. Jesus talks about marriage between a man and a woman. A man will leave his father and mother, and cling fast to his wife. Not, God made Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. It's just, so there's other places you can go. But like one of the arguments, I was reading a book by a theologian. And talking about 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verses 33 through 38, where it talks about women being submissive to their husbands. I do not permit a woman to speak in the assembly or to exercise authority over a man. Well, he just says, well, we all know that's not original. And in his commentary, he won't even talk about the text. He just says, well, we all know that's not original. And just goes on. It's like, wait a minute. Who's we all? And how do we know? Because we don't have a single manuscript out of 6,000 where that's not there. And nobody questions it for 2,000 years of the church's existence. So before you just say, well, we all know that's not original, how do we all know? It's kind of like, the statement made by him, well, Paul just perverted the gospel. Well, how do you know? Well, I don't like what he said. Well, that's awfully convenient, But I mean, people have that all the time. I mean, and we can laugh at homosexuality or women's roles in church, but I mean, people have been doing that for years. I mean, how many Bible studies have you had with somebody and showed them Matthew 28:18 through 20, or showed them Acts 2:38, or you showing them Acts 22:16? And so the Bible clearly states that for one to be a Christian, have their sins removed, you have to be immersed in water. It's called baptism. You're like, yeah, but I don't really think that's right. And so, but those same people would look at Eugene Bourne, maybe not for that particular passage, but for other things, or they would look at that homosexual person and say, well, you can't do that with the Bible. And yet, they do the exact same thing. It's just about, baptism, not homosexuality.
Well, the person may have been coming from the aspect, our modern translations freely use the word homosexual. If you go back to the King James Version, they'll use sodomy or sodomites or something of that nature.
Right.
But you would have to go back into Genesis and pick up on Lot in the town of Sodom and describe what was going on. Then you can carry the conversation forward. Yeah.
I mean, we can show them all types of ways. But I mean, it's very, very clear. I mean, it's very, from the Bible, from Genesis, going back to, like you were saying, the creation of man and woman to Sodom and Gomorrah, all the way to Paul's teachings in Romans and the Corinthian correspondence. I mean, it's there. And so really it all comes back, Michael, wonderful question, and you took up the rest of the class, and I appreciate you doing that. Thank you for that. I was worried. We don't want we won't let the kids down. They need to know that mom and dad are going to be longer in class. So it all goes back to the same thing. Are we going to mold our lives to the Bible's teachings? Are we going to mold the Bible to our lives? And that's, at the end of the day, whether homosexuality, baptism, the way the church is organized, it all goes back to the exact same motivation. Are we going to mold our lives and our thinking to what the Bible says, or are we going to change the Bible based on what I like? And that's exactly what Paul is fighting in Galatians, because these people are taking the scriptures and the gospel that he has preached, and they're twisting it. And Paul has got to say, you can't do that, right? You got to take what the Spirit gives you. Yeah, and that's how many people, we're not here to be popular, but we're here to be faithful. And we'll have to end on that note. I appreciate your comments and your questions, and really looking forward to our study of Galatians. And let's close the prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we're so thankful for this day and for all many blessings you've given us. We're so thankful that we're faithful men like the Apostle Paul who are willing to stand up to false doctrine and false teaching and boldly proclaim your truths. Dear Heavenly Father, please be with us and give us that same type of courage and faith that we will be able to stand for the truth, that we will not sit idly by as people take your word and twist it and lead others astray. Please help us to do it in a loving way, in a way that represents you and honors you, but also in a way that does not back down from the truth. We're so thankful for your faithfulness and your love for us. In your son's name we pray. Amen.